I think maybe we can start then. And so if some more latecomers come in, then they will just miss part of what I say, which is not that important. So welcome everybody. My name is Cosimo Paravano. I am a postdoc at the University of Vienna, and I have the great pleasure of moderating this event. This event takes place as part of Anti-Colonial Week, which has been organized by the student collective Univien for Palestine and by the Forum for Anti-Colonial Inquiry in the Humanities and Social Sciences. Anti-Colonial Week is a space for respectful exchange, solidarity, and mindful communication. The organizers reject all forms of discrimination and violence. We treat one another with appreciation and with respect, regardless of origin, gender, language, or identity. So any form of harassment or violence will result in exclusion from the event series and from this Zoom session. One word about why this is taking place online. The administration of the University of Vienna has decided to withdraw its premises for Anti-Colonial Week with very short notice and has forced us to change the location of many events. So if you want to support us, we have written an open letter to the rector, which will be posted in the chat box in a moment. Feel free to read it and sign it if you feel like it. Also, we feel free to subscribe to the FICE mailing list to be kept in the loop of what we do. And now to today's speakers. Arno Böhler teaches in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Vienna. He's currently leading a research project called Philosophy in the Arts, Arts in Philosophy, cross-cultural research on the significance of the heart in artistic research and performance philosophy, which is funded by the Austrian Research Fund. He was a visiting researcher at several institutions around the globe, the University of Bangalore, Heidelberg, NYU, Princeton. And his main research interests and publications concern continental philosophies, South Asian philosophies, performance philosophy, and artistic research. We are very happy to announce that his lecture today will be followed by a short reading by Susanne Valerie Granzer, who is an actor, a performer who performed at major European theaters, a widely published author, as well as Professor Emerita of Rollengestaltung at the Max Reinhardt Seminar at the University of Music and Performing Arts in Vienna. Together, they have developed a number of cross-disciplinary strategies between philosophy and the arts that have as sort of aim to give back to philosophy its materiality, corporeality, sensibility, and vulnerability. Today's talk is entitled Epistemic Violence, Deconstructing Eurocentric Formats of Knowledge. And the text which will be read is entitled Heartless. A Q&A will follow. I take the occasion to thank Roberta for taking care of the technical side of things, as well as so much of what is happening for this Anti-Colonial Week. We all look forward to hearing your talks on behalf of the organizers, Univien for Palestine and FICE. And I would like to thank you very much for accepting our invitation, and I am very happy to yield the screen to you.
So thank you, Cosima. Thank you, Roberta, for organizing this. And I'm very happy to support your initiatives because I think they are very important that we, in a certain way, also have perspectives or shared perspectives which are not only grounded in the European tradition. And this is also the topic I would like to speak about as a philosopher who is teaching at the University of Vienna since 30 years. And therefore, I was really also shocked and got many emails from international friends that they too were shocked that the University of Vienna could not host this at its at its at the places of university. This is the first time that I am not able to have a talk as a member of the University of Vienna since 30 years to speak at the University Vienna. But I don't want this too long, so that I'm not wasting time, because I see anti-colonial research as a research field. And therefore, I would like also to go now academically into reasoning, into arguing, and these kinds of episteme, which for such a long time were the governing principles of the academic space. But as we see right now in the example of this conference, this is obviously questioned. So I want to protect in a certain way and support this free speech academic space. So I would like to start my talk with a motto from Spivak. I think everybody knows her. I quote, "When Spivak demands a revision of aesthetic education in the era of globalization to break down the hegemony of a Eurocentric episteme, I would like to tackle this task in this lecture by following Nietzsche's deconstruction of the Socratic Platonic image of thought." So my first claim in this talk is that if one really takes seriously what Spivak says, that a big question is the question of aesthetic education in our global area. And I will come to this, why aesthetics is so important in this academic way of globalization and critique of the way how the episteme, the Platonic Socratic episteme, was globalized in the academic world. I would suggest in this task that the best way, that would be my argument, is if you really want to do this, to decenter this episteme, you really have to study the hegemonic form of episteme that is right now ruling the world of academia. And with Nietzsche, I would argue that the best way to do this is really to study Socrates and Plato. Yeah? And what happened there about 2,500 years ago at the beginning of so-called continental European philosophy. So I'm not interested in the figures Socrates and Plato, of course, as person, but I'm interested in the image of thought, as I would call it with Deleuze. So I'll call this the history of the spirit in a certain way is in different times and at different cultures starting to create certain images of thought. I take this Deleuzian term. And an image of thought is always a cultural way that in a certain way starts to rise, and in the case of Plato and Socrates, after 2,500 years of development, this episteme became hegemonic and the standard model of how to think about thinking within a culture that is primarily shaped by this Socratic European Platonic way of thinking. So it's not about person I'm speaking, but the names are showing the rise of a certain formation of thinking that after 2,500 years, as I would claim, became the hegemonic form of how we think today. So it's not just a historical research about what did the Greek culture think about thinking, but it is the way of what became the standard model of today, how to think. So my argumentation would be different. Even if you have never read Socrates and Plato, since you are cultivated and socialized in the academic world in a Socratic Platonic way of image of thinking, the question is the other, not what do I have to do with Socrates and Plato who lived 2,500 years ago, but how can I get rid of the image of thought which you have learned in the very moment to follow when you started to become part of the academic world. So that is the question. It's not so much about what did they say 2,500 years ago, but how are their mode of thinking, how did their mode of thinking become the standard model even today on a global area, as Spivak says, because through the European way of colonizing and globalization, this form is not just anymore a European continental form of thinking, but a thinking that becomes the standard model for all university and academic worlds. And so what they should do and how they should think when they enter the field of academia. Even if I use the word academia, of course, this is of Hellenistic, this is grounded in the Hellenistic culture. It was Plato who started to initiate the first academia. So if we use the word in daily use academic, we are already quoting Plato. Yeah? So it's very difficult if we are in this world not to think in this way, as he and Socrates, for me, started prominently to induce a certain kind of thinking. The antagonist of this way of epistemic knowledge, for me, is Nietzsche, who popped up also in Europe in the 19th century. But he was the first one who really radically started to criticize Plato and Socrates in the European tradition, and suddenly saw them not just as the good man, but started to criticize all the exclusions which were going hand in hand with the Socratic Platonic episteme. Yeah? So the problem which I'm speaking about now in this talk is neither a private problem of Mr. Arno Böhler, nor a problem of somebody who is interested in Greek culture, but the problem, as I wrote here, is historical. Now, let's go a little bit in what is the problem and what is the exclusion that has been originated in the Platonic Socratic way of episteme. So one problem is that they suddenly started to problemize the relation of art and philosophy. That's very strange, because before Socrates and Plato, it was so that the art were highly estimated as being part of philosophy. So philosophy in the pre-Socratic and pre-Platonic time of Greek culture, in the so-called Heraclitus, for example, and this is how usually we start to do history of philosophy in philosophy departments. We start with Heraclitus and Parmenides, of course, Greek thinkers. But what Nietzsche would say is that the pre-Socratic were still doing philosophy together with the arts in a kind of poetic way. And what happened with Socrates and Plato was that they started to discriminate this poetic way of doing philosophy, in which philosophy was necessarily also a form of artistic research. They now started to discriminate and degrade in their episteme the way how people were thinking before them. So this is why in 18th, even 18th and 19th century in continental Europe, suddenly there was this distinction coming up between Socrates and Plato. They started to do real philosophy, serious philosophy, as Nietzsche would say, and the pre-Socratics, they were just doing creating mythological or poetical, which now suddenly meant non-serious forms of doing research and philosophy. So as long as you are doing philosophy in a poetical manner, as they did before Socrates and Plato, you were called a so-called philosopher, says Cyrus. So afterwards, today, if somebody uses poetry together with philosophical research, most people, even outside of Europe today, would say, oh, this is not serious philosophy. And Plato, not only Plato, but also Aristotle, the famous student of Plato, starts his metaphysics with the saying of his time, his book Metaphysics, which was later called Metaphysics, with the words, the common saying of the times of Plato and Socrates suddenly were that, quote, poets are liars. So that poets are liars, you could not imagine that this sentence comes up, for example, in another research field in which I'm investigated, South Asian thinking, so Indian, that what we today geographically would strongly call Indian ways of philosophy. You could not imagine that in South Asian contexts that they would say in Vedic times, for example, that poets are liars, because their way of thinking, their way of epistemic knowledge was still strongly connected with the arts, and that means what goes hand in hand with the exclusion of the arts for Nietzsche in Socratic Platonic times is, if you exclude the arts, it's not just you are excluding a certain part of culture, but you are following a kind of model of thinking in which you degrade the senses, you degrade the affectivity, and you degrade the lived body. So these are the two strong degradations which took place in the Socratic Platonic image of thought for Nietzsche. So let me go here further. So what Nietzsche would say in a certain way, or what he's saying, is what he criticizes about this form of episteme, which is Socratic Platonic, is that it is a form of ascetic ideal. This is what he would name. And the ascetic ideal of thinking is thinking of thinking that it is something that is just taking place in an ideal world of abstract ideals. And it is excluding the lived body, affectivity, and sensuality. It is including the realm of the arts, as I said. So what the ascetic image of thought is following is what is the body of the researcher who are still following the Platonic Socratic image of thought. Nietzsche's answer would be, their body does want to have only one thing, and I quote here, repose in all cellular regions of the body. End of quote, Nietzsche. So what they say, it's a certain model of the body itself, the silenced body, the body that has no voice anymore in the argumentation of my epistemic or dialectical form of thinking. That is the first exclusion, which is very, very important for Nietzsche, and which Nietzsche would say, if we think of a future epistemic that is post-Socratic or post-Platonic, we have to undo this exclusion of, I quote again, the repose in all cellular regions of the body. That what Nietzsche says, what goes hand in hand with this epistemic knowledge or form of knowledge, is that with the exclusion of the lived body, the affects, the drives, they do not have any word anymore in your argumentations. You are just reducing arguments on discursive arguments, and you are not, for example, accepting a feeling which you have to be a serious argument. But I will say, if you include in a post-Socratic, post-Platonic, that means for Nietzsche in an aesthetic image of thought, you have to give back to the additional to the discursive form of argumentation to accept that instincts, that rebellious feelings which you have, the feelings are not just conservative, they are also resistant. Yeah? Even the desires are strongly resistant. When Rosa Parks, for example, saw the line that she's not allowed to sit in the bus because she's black, and if somebody white is coming in, that she has to leave. This is not just an argument on a discursive Socratic ideal realm of being, but obviously there were a lot of resistant feelings that were popping up in her body when she was reading this command that she has to leave her seat when somebody white is coming in. So I would say that it is very strong that we think that only the rational discursive forms of being are critical. Your body and your way of feeling, so in a certain way the seat of your heart, is also a very legitimate form of argumentation because you feel that something is going wrong. And that feeling is a form of resistance. And it's not just conservative repetition of a past. Even Freud here, I admire Freud a lot because Nietzsche, in a certain way, is really reinterpreting the reasons what Nietzsche would claim. So Freud would say, what he would criticize is what Socrates is doing. These are forms of rationalization, Freud would say. And the rationalization is that you have a bodily drive and desire, but you neglect that this is bodily rooted in some interests, and you take it as an objective argumentation and argument. So you are neglecting that your argumentations are highly channeled, as Nietzsche would say, by the drives and the interests which you are bodily following in your life. Yeah. So that is one of the big things where Nietzsche would say, if we think of a future post-Socratic way of episteme, you really have to start with bringing in and accepting and respecting the voices which are more bodily and just the voices which are discursively. That would be my strong argument. If you go through the history of the Socratic form of thinking, so for example, when you come to Kant, the European Enlightenment philosopher, Nietzsche would criticize, he is also following the same aesthetic image of thinking, for example, with the term disinterestedness. So if you become a modern European, you are called that you should have a position that is objective, that is not grounded in any forms of interest. So becoming objective, becoming disinterested for Nietzsche in a post-Socratic manner is just a lie. So he would criticize this as forms of excluding the body, who is always positioned in certain situations and is positioned in the middle of interest. So if you follow, but I think that would be the same, I guess, if you would study now at the university, at an academic institution in South Africa, in India, or somewhere else, there would be a command which tells you that you should become objective. But that means you are excluding the perspectivism of subjectivity from the mode of what you think, what thinking should be, the image of thinking. So I see the time is already quite, this is what I said. So if I come back now to Chakrabarty, I would say in provincializing Europe, he's exactly saying that this is the background that was that, for example, South Asian subaltern studies suddenly understood as the cultural imperative of European modernity. And that cultural imperative of European modernity called all cultures on this globe to become modern. But from an epistemic perspective, I would say to become modern means to become Socratic and Platonic. So you have to neglect the body as being a reason or sensuality as being an argument which should be included in your argumentation and not excluded. Yeah? So become sober, become disinterested, etc. These are these commands of European modernity and the Socratic episteme that was in a certain way colonizing on an epistemic manner and way all countries in the colonial period and the globalization period in a certain way. They have to follow this command of European modernity because, of course, when they were said to become modern, it was meant that they are becoming part of the movement of European modernity and not their form of modernity. This is why many scholars today speak of there have been many modernities in modernity and not just the European form of modernity. And probably I would like to finish. I would have a lot other things to say, but I would like to finish with one thing before I give over to Susanne. That what is very interesting,
I was just
especially.
going to say there's no rush. You can take your time, I think.
We still have time. Good. So, okay, so I can still go on. I thought it's 12, so but I have time till 12:15. I see before I give over. Okay, that's nice. So I don't have to rush. So this, in a certain way, what I said right now, from the perspective of the research project from the Austrian Science Fund, which I am leading right now since 2 years, and it will go on for 2 more years. By the way, it is located not at the University of Vienna, but at the University for Music and Performing Arts in Vienna. Michael Hagner, who is a science philosopher, yeah, he wrote a very famous book in 2007 about Homo cerebralis. And there he is showing that, for me, for our project, something very interesting was going on. If you just, as a science theorist, look what happened in the European modernity in medicine, in the history of modern European medicine, you can see an interesting shift before the 16th century, so-called the threshold of European modernity, the rise and beginning, the dawn of European modernity. Before you could still see that the heart was the center of cognition. So even the father of European logic, Aristotle, still claimed that it is the heart in which all forms of cognition do gather. So it was not a non-sensible form of thinking, but obviously with the heart you have a certain taste which shows you that probably something is going in the right or into the wrong direction. It sounds good or it sounds problematic. Yeah. And that's not just a discursive argument, but that's also a taste or a feeling which you have. So it's a certain kind of aesthetic cognition that is going on. And it's really interesting that the father of European logic, yeah, Aristotle, still thought that it's not the brain in which all your forms of cognitions are gathering, but it is the heart in which all these forms, the sensual and the discursive forms, are coming together and gives you a certain overall taste of what is going on. Aristotle even had the word koine aesthesis, which we could translate as synesthetic perception. Koine means coming together, general, universal form of aesthesis. And he meant that in the heart, in a certain way, there are all information which you have, your discursive information and your sensible informations are coming together and gives you a sense of taste of whether you can smell the rat, as the Americans beautifully say, whether you can smell that something in the atmosphere is going wrong. And I think that is very important if you think, for example, of the climate which we experience today in many cultures, also in the context of this conference, how it was handled. Yeah, a lot of people would have a feeling that something is going into the wrong direction right now. And that's a feeling, that's even, I would say, an aesthetic taste. Freud, between the two world wars, between World War I and World War II, had the title of a book that was Das Unbehagen in der Kultur in German. So the discomfort with culture. Yes, and that when he gives the title Discomfort with his culture between the First War and the Second World War, that is an argument for me in a post-Socratic, in a post-Platonic manner. We have to accept this an argument. Obviously, the title says that he felt that something is going wrong, that the climate was imploding. And I think a lot of people today would probably follow this title, Unbehagen in der Kultur. So what is important for me is that feelings are not just stupid. Yeah. In many rational discourse, you have the only intelligent way of deal and cope with research is discursively. But what is with that title, what Freud says? If you feel discomfort, yeah, and I feel absolutely discomfort when I hear that the university in which I'm teaching since 30 years is not giving us a space to discuss these matters. So I think I'm very Socratic in the moment, even if I argue against Socratic image of thought, because I'm arguing and we are speaking here together about different models. And of course, everybody's free to criticize what I'm saying here or to find something interesting in what I'm saying. And a university is usually a place in which exactly these discourses should take place. And it should look for the safety that and a forum that such discussions as we are having here have to take place. Otherwise, it is not fulfilling its function, its social function. As I said, it cannot be that in so-called liberal democracies, we are not allowed to speak about these things which we are doing right now in a public space, because even in Middle Ages, the university were the place in which you could criticize the devil. They had disputations, and even in the Catholic political situation where the Catholics were ruling Europe, even there it was possible at the universities to neglect the existence of God or to argue for the devil. So it cannot be that we call our societies liberal democracy, but we are less free in the academic space to speak about topics less than it was in the Catholic times of Middle Age. Yeah? So that is something that is creating miscomfort in myself, as Freud says. So there is something going wrong. And this is, I tried to argue the best I can in a discursive manner, but at the same time, I accept that this is also a taste and a feeling that I have in a post-Socratic manner of taking this feeling to be an argument, and that I have to reflect on this feeling. Why is this feeling popping up in this situation, for example, and why did it pop up in Freud between First and Second World War in Europe? So what is interesting, as I said, is, like as Michael Hagner says, that in the same time when 16th century, when European modernity started its rise till today, up to a certain degree, at the same time there was a shift that the heart is no more the center of cognition, but the brain. Yeah, this is very beautiful. If you look into the history of European modernity and medicine, you see suddenly more and more it culminates in brain study and in the idea that all forms of knowledge are centered in the brain and no more in the heart. Yeah. So for our project, this is just to say this is a quite interesting moment. Now, since I have a little bit more time, I would go back into what Nietzsche here says about his own philosophy in order not to become only critical, because there I have one slide which I would criticize also the word of this week, because for me the word anti-colonial, starting with the anti, is exactly a Socratic Platonic way of dialectical thinking. So if the anti-colonial week really would like to get rid of the Platonic and Socratic way of thinking, it should not start with the anti, because that's exactly how we are trained in academia since a long time, that every form of history is dialectical and it is the negation of negation. So I just want to put this as a critical point on the table, because it's so, and I say this shows how difficult it is to really decolonize our mindset. This is very difficult because we are so much trained and used to think in the patterns of this episteme, which I'm here criticizing. So Nietzsche's mantra, my philosophy is reversed Platonism, this is a famous sentence which runs several times through Nietzsche's work. So my philosophy is reversed Platonism. And Nietzsche is not simply seeing himself as being the opposite of Plato. He says also that, divine Plato is really, I feel most intimate with this artist philosopher Plato. So there he would protect in a certain way Plato against Socrates, who has spoiled for him the artist Plato, and started to implement in Plato himself this Socratic way of episteme. So my philosophy is reverse Platonism is almost a shock for Nietzsche, because he feels there is such a lot of beauty, there is such a lot of art in Plato. But if you look then what he says, he's doing almost the opposite in his philosophy, taking up the Socratic form of dialectical argumentation. And by picking up this dialectical form, he starts to hate the arts, even though he's an artist and the way he's expressing his philosophy is still artistically. But when you say, what is Plato just saying? He excludes the arts from the ideal state. He's criticizing no more than the artists are just like they have a perverse almost form of knowledge or episteme. So that was wondering Nietzsche and even shocking Nietzsche that what happened that even Plato, this artist philosopher, was suddenly, one could say, even subjecting himself under the Socratic form of episteme, yeah, which was entangled with all the exclusions I was speaking so far. So I would like to end here probably with a nice sentence from Wittgenstein, which is very crucial for me in what I'm saying here about. I would like to read the quote first from the Philosophical Investigations. Quote, "An image held us captive, and we could not get out, for it lay in our language, and it only seemed to repeat it to us relentlessly." So that's exactly when we call it anti-colonial week, we are exactly in this problem which Wittgenstein faces here. What I would claim with Nietzsche is the image that held us in the academic field captive is the Socratic Platonic episteme. And we cannot get out of it because it is strongly shaping the language that we are speaking in academia. So in order to come out of the Platonic Socratic way of episteme, there are two things crucial. We have to deconstruct the form or the style of language that is forced. So I, as a philosopher, usually just my language in articles should be reduced to just bring up arguments. You know, you cannot argue poetically and you cannot argue sensually. And therefore, I would say, when we want to change this episteme, we have to change the style of speaking and writing in a certain way. The best way for me is to bring in artistic forms of praxis and bring them together with philosophical ways of argumentation. And therefore, I would like to end and hand over to Susanne with a text that is artistically. So I want to, in fact, do here what I am saying in a performative sense. The text is doing that what I'm in a certain way demanding as a swift from an aesthetic form image of thinking into an aesthetic image of thinking or episteme.
I would like to add the text is trying to escape of this narrative Arno was talking about. And I call this text heartless, and it's a kind of format which I try to develop, which a name is given poetic unfoldings. So again, heartless. Addicted to death, fugitive from death. And as a preface, a quote from Sophocles' Antigone: "Monsters are many things, but nothing more monstrous than man." And I had the opportunity to be once Antigone on stage. 1. Over and over again, the same miserable, terribly dying under an insentient, indifferent sky. Drowned dead, slaughtered dead, random dead. Massacred bodies, silenced in horrifying ways, helplessly, defenseless, on the run, without rights, on the roads, on the ocean, away at any price, from hunger, from war, from death. Or trapped on the ground, under missiles and drones, bleeding to death in a waste land. Others stationed at the front, in the middle of the war, on one of its side, attacked from the other side, without a way out. There is nothing heroic about front lines, nothing. Always one and the same naked violence. And always the same untimeliness of death. 2. How to write about terror and misery that happens to others? How to write about the horror of wars, about the excess of violence, the excess of horror, the excess of suffering that we do not know and that has spared us here and now so far? How to write about the war that we only know from public media, from rumors, mainly speaking from one side, from the dreadful dead end of yes or no. How to write about the death of others that we do not personally know by their names? 3. Beyond our imagination are these dehumanized corpses, torn into pieces, desecrated, lying on the streets, dug out from ruins or ashes, exhumed from graves, from mass graves, corpses in plastic bags, air and liquid tight. Finally, a wooden coffin? Perhaps, or none at all. Tristesse beyond one's grasp. Outrageous anger. There is nothing to gloss over, nothing to excuse from no one. There is disaster upon disaster, trauma upon trauma to be passed down. Transversal lines of pain running through generations, deprived of its reality in the media. 4. Death is prospering so radically. Even though we Europeans have repressed him, forgotten, eliminated, locked him away in clinical rooms in the zones of the Western world. Ars moriendi? What could this mean for us today? The art of dying? The art to confront ourselves with the other side of our mortal lives? A shrug of the shoulders. Buy yourself happy. So the telling name of a German company. Why so polemical? So hypocritical, moralistic? Isn't Epicurus right? And 2000 years ago he stated in a postmodern fashion, quote, death should not concern us at all. Because as long as we are, death does not exist. And once when death hits us, we are no more. End of quote. 5. But what happens to those who survive the death of others? Their death hits them, triggers their hearts, makes them trembling, pierces their lived bodies. They did know them by name. They have accompanied them. Through their death, the radicality of dying reveals itself to us, the survivors. 6. Your death digs a hole in my life, sucks my heart dry. Your death makes me desolate. It tears a hole in my life. Fearful shadows everywhere, on walls, in the air, in the breath. The present and no more. The future and no more. The past and no more. Never again. Life falls into an abysmal absence. 7. Circle of melancholy. Circle of fear. A vicious circle. And the demons laugh sarcastically. It is their victory. It seems. Thank you.
Okay. Hello. So we are back.
Okay.
Yeah.
Hello. Yes. Thank you so much to both of you. This was, I think, incredibly rich. And before I open the Q&A, I just have a quick question whether the text that has just been read, Heartless, is available somewhere, or if it's something that if people want to.
Yeah, so far it is not published.
Okay.
But if someone wants it, I'm free to decide on my own. So why not? So
Okay. It was just.
But that text is still, we are using this for a performance,
Okay.
which will be in April 9 to 12. We have our festival where we will present all the research on the heart for the first 2 years. And there this text then will be shared with the public and afterwards published.
Okay. Thank you. It was just a quick follow-up on that. But once again, thank you so much. And with this, I would like to open the Q&A. You can raise your hands and then unmute yourself and open your camera. We already have a few questions in the chat box that I will be reading. I have perhaps also a question myself, but if there are no raised hands, electronic raised hands, I will go on and read. Okay, there is one question. I will first read a question from the chat box and then give the floor to Alessandra. So I will first maybe read, even though we're online, there seems to be already a dialogue going on in the chat box, which I think is great. I will read a couple questions so that both of you can share your thoughts. One is, what about saying decolonial rather than anti-colonial? And then a question asks, if academia, which comes from ekas and demos, meaning away from community, which is akin to ivory towers, is so ingrained in the Western tradition of research and knowledge production, what would be an alternative name or an alternative concept that moves us away from Eurocentrism and towards decoloniality? And there is a response to that question. Why not different centers of knowledge for different approaches? So I think there's here the question of alternative centers. Do you want to first respond to that?
Yes, the question of thank you for your questions. Yeah, the question of the anti-colonial or decolonial. Yeah, that is very crucial.
Sorry, I will interrupt because I am happy to read the whole question, where the question is asked of why people always become sort of become anti-academia activists after they have assembled university degrees, etc. So we are also happy to accept criticism and whether you want to integrate it in your question.
Yes.
It is a burning question of, which I think is part of the overall question. In what way can academia contribute to this? Can it at all? Can it not? So yes, I wanted to complete the question. Yes.
Yeah. So probably I start with this last thing. I was not criticizing really in my biography certain forms of academia after I have had my many degrees. Yeah. But in the very moment when I entered the academic world, it became clear for me that this exclusion of the body is principle in a certain way in this what I see. So I always say I was a student who was highly interested in the text, but I had from the very beginning, long before I had a degree, a problem with how these texts were performed, how conferences are organized, how people are often unpaid. So think, for example, of that difficulty that, for example, you have to go to academia sometimes to have your presentations as a student, but you have to finance this often on your own. Yeah. So you are doing unpaid work all the time when you're in academia. So the rooms, even the way how you eat, think of the way what is usually offered in a conference. There is water and cookies. So is that really reflected in the academic world that, for example, what you eat probably is important, yeah, also for the way you are thinking. So I was starting as a student long before I had the degrees that there is obviously, I did not have the problem so much in the text, but in the way how they were now situated in the academic world. And this was the reason why we already as students, I met Susanne, and we immediately started to work on the formats and the change of the formats of which have usually been ritualized in the academic world. So that was not something that came after we had, in a certain way, a certain name in academia. But this was really the very first impression how I, as a student, was already seeing that something is here not, there is a performative self-contradiction going on. The text, what they say, is not what they do.
I would like to give an answer to that question of my biography. I was just a classical actress for 20 years. And after 10 years, and I was reading a lot, I was always interested in a lot of questions which pop up in philosophy. And I was simply alone with that. Yes. And then there was an interesting crisis I had to go through. I've been in Frankfurt at the Schauspielhaus Frankfurt, and I was per purpose going there because they had a Mitbestimmung. There was a different, it was not one director, but the ensemble had a voice. Yes. And it was simply, I would say it was a crisis which popped up in my life, because you should not idealize the arts on the other hand. The arts are also in this split. They idealize their emotions, and what I experienced there was an emotional excess. It was simply disaster. And the Mitbestimmung was then put from the political point of view out of its juridic implementation. And this was the moment when I went to academia, to the philosophy department. And I studied philosophy just on my own demand, not to have a degree, but to have a support in understanding the texts. And meanwhile, I was already a professor. And my colleague said now she's gone a little bit curious because she's studying philosophy. Does she want to be an actress, or does what happens to her? And I just want, it's more complicated than to do one or the other. I think the things have to be married in a kind of way.
Yes, and this brings us to the second question back, where, yes, I think with Deleuze, I would offer the idea of the self as being layered. Yeah. So we have to think of which layer, which knowledge is right now popping up and we are speaking about. Do we speak of knowledge that is strongly effective, or do we speak of knowledge that is strongly reasonable? I don't think there is we should not follow the logic of the either or, as Susanne says, but we should follow these are layers in ourself. So our self is layered. And therefore, we always have to distinguish which layers of ourselves are now speaking up and popping up.
Thank you very much. Also for the question, I think that the responsibilities of academia should be a matter of discussion. And we can now go to Alessandra and then to Roberta.
First of all, thank you for the amazing lecture and performance. I really enjoyed and learned a lot. My question is sort of a follow-up of the debate that we were opening. Actually, I wanted to ask you, to both of you, do you think that it'd be worth integrating also a sort of artistic and education, or education into aesthetic ways of thinking within the university programs and curricula, and how do you picture that in the future, or in an ideal academia? And maybe do you know already some examples of good practices that you yourself have practiced, or that you know from other people?
Yeah, thank you. This question is very important for us, because we always try to really do what we are here thinking. So there are, even in our research projects on the heart, we call it cross-disciplinary research in artistic research and performance philosophy. So artistic research and performance philosophy, we read as two fields of research which are right now going on, who try to create such a post-Socratic form of education also. Yeah. So we are, since Susanne and I, we are since 20 years in these research fields, because we think that there is something interesting going on. And in a certain way, you exactly have, that would be our sense. Why we take it almost as natural, even in Vienna, where they are so proud of the arts, that there is an art university and there is then a science university. Yeah. So why do these things have to be split in such a radical ways at even different universities, not just different disciplines in one way or another, but different university? And exactly what you said, why is not, let's call it not just art, but as aesthesis, sensual training, being in touch with your body, part of the philosophical education? If I think of South Asian philosophies and way of doing philosophy, of course, everybody today knows the word yoga. Yeah? But that means in a certain way that physical praxis has been an important part of your philosophical training. Or in Chinese philosophy, you often had painting as being an important discipline for academic training. So that would exactly be something we are since 20 years or even longer practically also doing and trying to support. That is research that is normal. Even in the university, we have right now a case. I'm teaching exactly therefore at two universities, an art university and the philosophy. But I would, in my perfect world, it would be that they would not be two universities, but the training would be one. Yeah, that would be the ideal world. And still at the art university, we have right now a case in artistic research where you see all these, what I was speaking about, so concretely clashing. Because even at the art university, you will have the split of the theorists and the practitioners. And for example, if they come together and you try to be to create something that is both artistic theory and implementing theory into your artistic work, you have to struggle a lot, because these patterns and images are forms of subjectivation, as Foucault says. So they have created institutions and reality. Yeah. And so once you see suddenly, so for example, this conference, when it fights against certain European ways of thinking things, people feel to be offended and attacked. Yeah, some people. And the same is if you want to bring art and theory together, it's not just an academic theoretics. You will see that people will defend this differentiation. I am a theorist and you are a practitioner. I don't want to have this blurred. So this creates a lot of conflicts in reality. It's not so easy and idealist.
Yes, there would be a lot to say from my point of view, but I think there were maybe
Yes.
better
Yes,
to.
want to keep the Q&A going. Roberta?
Yes, so thank you for also mentioning your critiques on the name of Anti-Colonial Week. That was super insightful and interesting to me as well, because of course it is in this binary of colonial, anti, or D or whatever. So I totally agree with you. I think my question is, I have two kind of questions. One, I think my point of view is that sometimes it can be necessary or useful to kind of position yourself as some kind of counter discourse. So I think that's also why we chose the name, but I totally understand your critics. And I think my second question then would be, or my actual question, do you have any alternatives, or do you have anything, any alternative names for this week, as we will probably want to do this again, of course, next year. So yeah, if you could maybe just
yes, for example, to make it concrete, Nietzsche is using the word counter-ideal, because of course he is using the word counter-ideal as an opposition to Plato and Socrates in his times. But as you mentioned, we, for example, would have the word of the counter-narratives, yeah, which for me would be much more Spinozist. Because Hegel, who is exactly one of these dialectical thinkers, who would always start with the ante. Yeah, this is Hegel, this is Adorno, this is critical theory. Yeah, but that is also my critique on critical theory. And this is even what people from the road in a certain way would criticize about critical theory, that they can only start with negations, but they cannot offer something positive. Yeah, and therefore I would, like Deleuze, I would like to get rid of Hegel, who is a Socratic philosopher for me, and replace him by the way, Jewish philosopher Spinoza, who was exactly saying, you know, it's not so simple that history is there is one position and then you have the counter position and that really lead to a third position. Yeah, this dialectical form of thinking. But what you have is the power to create counter narratives, to create alternative, or like Foucault would say, heterotopical thinking. So he would say, not this is not utopical, because utopical is always you are thinking something that will happen in the future. But a heterotopical way of thinking in Foucault's term is something where an alternative is growing and starting to posit itself as an alternative to the other. You know, so that is not just the anti, but it is an alternative that is concretely taking place as something you can choose then also. Yeah, it's there, but it has something that has to be created first as an option that shows up in the space. So that would, I even would say now, but of course this would not, these are suggestions to think about from your perspective, yeah, anti-colonial week, so heterotopical counter narratives or something like this would be less dialectical for me from its formation.
I don't know whether this fits here in or not, but you can have an experience, and maybe this is a perspective you can look at. In creativity, in the performing arts, there is always a paradox happening. Agens and patiens are happening at the same time. So you have to act and to let it go. And this simultaneity, Agamben is talking about this very beautifully. And this paradox, if you find a language for your initiative, that this paradox is grasping it in a word or in a sentence or in a formulation, maybe this is a way you can look for.
Yes. We in our project, that is, we would call it sensible thinking, because to bring in the sensitivity, to bring in sozusagen this, to undo this polarity of brain and heart, of discursive thinking and of pre-discursive thinking, we try to overcome or cross these distinctions by using the word of sensible thinking, or thinking, feeling, feeling, thinking. Yeah, this would be ways of not trying just to say the opposites, but rather to bring several binary layers together, yeah, and bring them into a dialogue rather than into a dialectic relation.
Thank you very much. We have a question from Ovidio.
Yes, hello. I don't have a camera, so I'm sorry for that.
No problem.
I wanted to ask, so if the idea is to like bring the arts and the academics together and to sort of get rid of this strong dissection of arts and academic, of mind and body, in the structure of today's lecture and performance, it was still kind of a hard cut between those two. So it was a very like academically presented lecture followed by a very artistic way of dealing with life. So my question would be, do you do this as a kind of as a first step that is still acceptable in the today's ways of academia, or is it something that is just the best way you can see to combine it right now, or do you have ideas that bond it together more seamlessly, so to say? I hope my question makes sense.
Yes, of course, this makes absolutely sense. So what we did today is not typical for our work. Usually we are, this is now Zoom. And so we made this distinction. If you come, you're very much invited to come to our research festival at Brut Northwest, which is a theater location, for example, which makes already a big difference to do a scientific research in a theater. And there you will see that we are exactly trying, 14 key researchers over 3.5 days will try to create formats in which we would not have this distinction which we had today. But that's important for us because we also want to have a voice in academia. So as long if I go into a classical academic context, I also want to be able to discuss with them in their Socratic manner and criticize in their way, in a certain way, so that they can understand with argumentation, etc., question their way of academic episteme. But what we are usually doing since 25 years is exactly what you are saying, trying to find force in which we are already following an aesthetic image of thought, in which you will not so easily be able to distinguish whether we are now philosophers or whether we are artists.
Yeah, on the other hand, I would like to add that one don't have to, I can only know the German version, das Kind mit dem Bade ausgießen. That means there is a special quality in philosophy and there is a special quality in the arts. And this should not be extinguished, but there should be not an exclusion from one of the other. And there should be a kind of new trying out, as we Arno described now. But on the other side, yes, as I already said, that there are special qualities which are has the one and the other, and so that's it's also not to neglect.
Thank you very much for the answer. Just one quick follow-up question. Where would I get more information about the research days?
There is a website at the research catalog. This is the Forum for Artistic Research. They have an own platform which is organized by most art universities in Europe. And there one can freely use it as a kind of website. It's more than a website, it's a repositorium. It's called the Research Catalog, and there it's the heart. I can send the link of the website in the chat box. Yeah, so we have the project has a quite big website or catalog, and on April 9 to 12 next year, the research festival will take place at Brut. So there we will have the big first exposition of our research process in the theater. Yeah,
Perfect.
but
Thank you.
I can send you a link into the web.
Yes, a link was also shared in the chat box. And
From our hard project.
No, I mean, feel free to share that too in the chat box.
Yeah.
We have a follow-up question. Yes, okay, that was indeed the. We have a follow-up question that sort of bears on once again on academia. Isn't the biggest problem in academia rather the scarcity of jobs and academic knowledge, in such a way that academic knowledge serves as sort of entrance control, as guaranteeing jobs to white bourgeois elites? So rather the question of gatekeeping in academia, and isn't the competition of knowledge also a competition of careers, that is to say money? And also a follow-up question on this idea of not separating an artistic institution from a sort of more academic institution. How do you want to protect in such a scenario that there wouldn't be or that there won't be a hierarchy between philosophy and the arts. And then I have one question myself, but I will just let you answer that question. If you can also read it in the chat box. So one is more about gatekeeping in academia, and one is in this artistic and academic institution that we are trying to envision. How do you make sure that there is no sort of hierarchy between the two?
Also the first question for me is, of course, very crucial, but there I have a very clear position. You know, that question comes not from academia, but from the neoliberal form of academia, which you all experience right now. Yeah. So since 2002, even in Austria, there was the change of the law, university law, and that explicitly says that the university is now organized autonomously as a company. So when I studied in the 80s and in the 90s, in the 80s, there was a very different form of organizational structure of the university. What you are experiencing, and that is really a bad fate which you have, is that there is almost no outside anymore, that you can find a university that is not economically organized and structured from its very structure. And of course, if you come in these universities, which are organized in this neoliberal way, they are suddenly understood as an education for jobs. Yeah. So that is already the neoliberal way of what does it mean to study, because you study because you want to have a job. So if you look why at the origin of the Platonic Academia, it was that you want to see an idea. Yeah, or you were studying the truth even, something like this. So, but still, don't think you cannot, most of you probably cannot experience any other education that would not be capitalistic neoliberal organized. But even if you go to South Asia and India, you will find several institutions who are still doing a kind of education that resists the European way or the Socratic way of doing academia. So these organizations do still exist on our globe today. But of course, they have been occupied and organized by capitalistic neoliberalist societies that it looks, and now the important word, as if there would be no outside. Yeah? And under your condition under which you are subjectivated and socialized, you can almost not have an eye how the university was even functioning 40 years ago, because you have no experience anymore of it. You think that this is the only model, but this is a quite new model, especially in Europe. Yeah, the Eastern Europe also, they have had very different systems at the universities. But right now, you are absolutely right. It's about making a career and getting a job. That's even what I have to mediate as a teacher at the University in Vienna. So it's strongly that we have to go through, and that you will get a job. But at the other side, you have to say, so that means you are forced by the system, the people, as Foucault would say, to become one of its agents. So you are becoming an elite in the way of becoming an elite of neoliberal society. And that is a big challenge, as Foucault would say. Yeah. Also that would be my a little bit pessimistic or tragic reading of your situation right now. But this is not the academia. This is not a question of academia. This is the question of neoliberal organization of academia, which is not the same.
UUG 2002.
Yes.
This was the new
university.
University.
Okay. I have a final question of my own. One thing I really liked about today was that how you tried to connect what happened to Anti-Colonial Week with more general concerns about sort of the role of feelings, so to speak, and emotions in academia. So I'm trying to work out my question, but can you give us some examples or from your own sort of experiences in artistic or academic practice of how this sensible thinking can help, let's say, poke a hole into public discourse and media representation of underrepresented groups? What I mean to say is that I often have the impression that one of our problems is that there's so much panic and feelings related that then are then conducive to discrimination. People sort of have very little experience of marginalized and underrepresented groups. And so I was wondering whether this approach that you're arguing for, sensible thinking, can sort of, even in small contexts, sort of facilitate communication and giving sort of more visibility to the topics that are very much part of Anti-Colonial Week. So like in examples where people kind of, I don't want to say change their mind, but kind of were able to understand a different perspective, and therefore sort of take a step back from you know, that reaction of panic or fear or that sort of keeps discrimination going. This is a sort of a bit of a convoluted way of asking the question, but I was wondering if you had, if I made myself clear. Otherwise, I can.
Yeah. Would you like?
Yeah, there are a lot of things rushing through my head. We didn't mention, and I think you shouldn't overlook that. You are the first generation which was grown up with the media.
Mm-hmm.
Don't forget that. What does this is doing? I don't curse it or something like that, but it does something too. I know this from the students. I'm quite in an age, and I know now students from different periods, and there is a different way of looking at things and different ways which because you were speaking of anxiousness and so on and so forth, and how to protect oneself from this influence. This is one way. And the other way, I use now a word, you have to use it on a quotation mark. You have to be a kind of warrior for the passionate dimension you were looking at. And you have to stand for it. And you have to find your own way out of this jungle. And we are right now in a kind of jungle, and the crisis is not a crisis of one person, it's a crisis of the new organization of Europe and the whole world. The might or the powers are changing now their situation. And this is a really, the crisis was always also a chance. This is maybe a cryptic way to answer,
No,
but
it's, yes.
No, and I would say, you know, there are two things. So one, if we speak of, I was speaking of exclusion. And I would say the first step is a very general step, that academia is usually excluding your feelings. Yeah? So they are not relevant in academia. Yeah? They are no argument or something like this. So to bring in that voice is already a first step. The next thing is that, of course, if you open that box of Pandora in a certain way, this also needs a certain expertise so that that becomes not chaotic. Yeah, so we have fair Viennese actionism, so where simply they opened the box and very often it became very destructive. Yeah, so in a second step, when you open that box, you have to go through these experiences very carefully and sensitive. And what you can learn, that is something what helps in a certain way, very practically, is, for example, that I do not personalize this experience. That is what I did in a certain way when I see that the episteme of Socrates is a historically generated history that is having me under the grip. The same is true with panic or such kind of feelings. So that often helps that I can learn to distance myself from the panic because I understand that it's not only my panic. Yeah, it's not just the personal private things, but I suddenly feel that this is a whole history that has inscribed itself in myself. So that panic has I would with Nietzsche say, genealogical reasons. And that is often very releasing, very practically for people if they do these things and see this not, the feeling is just a private thing, but the feeling is something that pops up in me, but that has a genealogy. And if I try to understand that genealogy, which is often bound, of course, with marginalized, traumatized experiences, then in a certain way, I can depersonalize that experience. And that is that one can learn, for example, from Indian aesthetics, that the arts are not making something personal, but in Indian aesthetics, the art is a praxis that depersonalizes your experiences. It desubjectivates yourself. It helps you to get rid of yourself as just a private person. And so the arts also very often help here, but of course we are entering a dangerous zone in the very moment where we open the box of Pandora. This is also the reason why it was excluded for such a long time. Yeah.
But you know, in the myth, in the box of the Pandora, down there at the very end, there is the hope.
Yes.
And it's the last which is released, the very last. And maybe just a playful moment for me. And what there is the word distance. This is always a go away, go into distance. But if you write this and then make a was heißt das? A siphon and play dance, you have dance immediately. You can go into, you cannot dance without keeping a kind of distance to the other. Yes, and to have this implement this as a way of dealing with daily life problems, to always to remember that there is a distance to be kept. It's very simple, but maybe this is a
Thank you.
small little.
Yes. So I think we can take five or so more minutes to wrap up the the conversation, and I will read what's in the chat box. But I will sort of stop taking questions from now on. And so one question is, by the time one is sort of the recipient of research money, one's mind or one's heart has been sort of overwritten with that type of thinking. And I think that could go back to what Arno was saying about possibly artistic practice being one possible, or not just, let's say, artistic and philosophical practice, and sort of antidote to that. But it would be interesting to hear what Arno himself has to say. And then another question, how can we differentiate our feelings that may already be shaped by the system of thinking we learn from quote unquote true feelings? Or maybe what I listen to And is there a meta position possible which is not guided by the same discourse which guides our thinking in the Socratic way? So what do you think about that? And finally, and this will be the final question, do you dislike the identity politics approach to decolonization activism, which is a very large question and a very relevant one?
Yes, so I think the first question we spoke quite a lot already. Yeah, so this is the answer would be for me, I understand myself as being a layered self. Yeah. So it's not an either or, but it is giving a voice to the more layers we let speak, the more voices are speaking in myself, the more objective, Nietzsche once says, we are. Yeah? So that is the one thing. Then the last question, so the second question was the power question. That's exactly the question of Foucault, and there I am on the side of Deleuze, to say it philosophically. That means Foucault always asks, is there an outside of the system? Yeah, is it possible to go outside of power when we are already trained and socialized by the power? Yeah, so I'm not speaking about the state without having been socialized already in a certain state. Yeah, so that's Hegelian in a certain way. Yeah, so I have already a family which has socialized me before I speak about and reflect about the family. Yeah, that is the big problem of Foucault, that he says, so how can you come, for example, in my example, out of the Socratic image of thought when you are socialized and your whole surrounding is socialized in this thought? My answer to Foucault would be I think Foucault is not coming out of this problem, really. So, but his friend Deleuze is giving an answer. We are strongly socialized by the might of power, but we are not entirely socialized by the might and power. So, for example, there are always feelings in myself which rebel against also the Socratic form of episteme, which I experience strongly in myself and outside in the institutions, etc. So that is never, this is always that all forms of even capitalism, I would claim, will once implode. So right now it looks as it cannot implode because it is the system that is strongly shaping us. But I'm sure there will be enough resistance on the long term that will also let this system fall down. So the system can never control you absolutely, yeah, because there will always be resistance that is popping up. And the last question,
I just want to say one sentence. We are not a ready-made thing. And this is a huge opportunity and a huge, maybe also frightening, but also opening up that we are not a ready-made thing. So yes. This is it.
It looks as if we were, but we are in fact not. That also goes to the question, so how can you come back to your real, I think she has said real or true feelings instead of the so-called commanded feelings? There I cannot go into this, but there I think really Asian philosophy is helping us a lot because they have thought about this very long time. I cannot go, this would be too long to go into this detail. But the last question is important for me. You know, I am still socialized in a generation who was coming from Derrida, Butler, Avital. I was in the 19s in New York, yeah, at NYU and at Princeton, but strongly at NYU. And there were Zizek, and there were Derrida, there were Avital, there were Judy Butler. These were my teachers in a certain way in the 90s. That was a very messianic form of experience. Yeah, they thought almost in a Hegelian sense, we are the the avant-garde of the spirit right now on this globe, which was very beautiful in a certain way, which we had. But what I answered to the activist identitarian politics, I am socialist in the absolute opposite. Yeah. So I am socialized, and I still stick to this, that one should not identify. Yeah. That identification is exactly the problem that is closing up. That is exactly, for example, what Susanne said. There is always an openness that is outside, that can go into an outside. So if you start to create closed identities, yeah, you are falling back, I say it very clearly from up, in reactionary patterns. And that is exactly of many movements which I see critical right now, that, you know, why does certain, in Austria we have Sellner, yeah, who does identitarian politics and is the very right. So I am coming from a left that was very strongly resisting our deep desire to identify. And that would also be very in line with with the Socratic dialectical form of thinking, which I criticized in this talk. So I don't think that you can create, and even I think you should not create these closures, as Derrida would say. That these closures are very difficult. And I can promise you that at the end, the left and the right will not be distinguishable up to a certain degree anymore, because they both follow identical. I am following non-identical philosophies, which, by the way, is not just Derrida, I want to say, but it's very Asian.
Yes,
Yeah.
and to bring in the
South
Asian, there is a beautiful the book from Nietzsche, Dawn, Morgenröte, and the subtitle is, help me with the English, there are such a lot of dawns who have not yet shone. And I'm kind of, in my heart, I'm an artist. I have some kind of guiding lines which help me up in the anxiety and so on and so forth. And maybe also the second, what Nietzsche is offering, wie man wird, was man ist, how to become who I am, and never stop this question, asking this question. And this could gain a huge power, because again and again asking myself, who am I, or who do I want to have become once? In this kind of, there are such a lot of dawns who have not shone yet. This is, for me, a very practical answer.
And really, to finish with the last sentence for me, with a non-European sentence, with the sentence that is coming from the second field of my research, from South Asian philosophy. If you go into many of these texts, say, neti, neti, this is not me. As long as you identify with something, you are already trapped in the narcissistic mirror, as Lacan would say, of how you see yourself in your mirror. In the mirror, you see yourself as an identity that is standing in front of the mirror. But South Asian, not European, South Asian cultures, from the very beginning, this is not just Derrida, it's not just Butler, start with the saying, don't identify. If you identify, you are mirroring yourself in a mirror. And that is not your true self, if I use this phrase because somebody used it. That is always a self-objectivation, to say it philosophically. And so you are following an image of yourself. And on the long time, this is always not working. Yeah, because you don't see the self as being something that is beyond this image.
I think this is a wonderful way to end our today's conversation. And once again, thank you very, very, very much to both of you for agreeing to participate in our Anti-Colonial Week. And I will just take a moment to announce our next event, which will be at 3 at the AKP Center, Lustkandelgasse 10. Birgit Englert will be talking about traveling in solidarity from the 1960s to the present day, a focus on South Africa and Palestine. So I hope I will see many of you there. And once again, thank you to everybody who attended, and also to Roberta for taking care of the technical side, and as well as shouldering so much of the work of Anti-Colonial Week. Thank you and goodbye.
And thank you, Roberto, for
Yes.
your work.
Yeah.
Okay, see you all. Thank you so much. Bye bye.
Okay, thank you. Bye.